Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Dentzel Domain on Red State Talk Radio. I am your host, Ed Dentzel, on today, May 30th, 2016, which is Memorial Day, and we're going to be talking about Memorial Day, the military. We're actually going to talk a little bit about nuclear weapons on this show. Haven't touched that topic in a while, but being that Barack Obama was in Japan and Hiroshima recently, gave a speech there, I thought today would be the perfect day to talk about that. But first, I was down at the beach the last 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, this past weekend. I guess it's a 3-day weekend technically. But I got to tell you, you talk about Americans getting bigger, they are. I have a joke, and I don't mean to be rude or anything else, but we do have a weight problem in this country. We do. How do I put this? I'm 45 years old. Now, I will admit that I am somewhat more vain than the average guy. Definitely the average 45-year-old, and probably more than your average guy for whatever reason. And I should not be one of the skinnier people on the beach. When I just take a walk, I go down from my place, I walk down to John's Pass and come back. I should not be one of the skinnier guys on the beach. Now, granted, I'm 5'9", 177 pounds, and I work out and stuff, but most of the people on the beach are younger than I am. They should not be bigger than I am, but they are. And it's going to prove to be, I think, as these people get older, a condition that's going to put a lot of stress on our medical system, whether we have Obamacare or perfect conservative medical care. It's going to be quite taxing on it. There's no doubt in my mind. People, get in shape. There's a joke that I started to tell maybe a year after I moved here to Madeira Beach, Florida, is, you know what the best thing is about St. Pete Beach? Women in bikinis. You know what the worst thing is about Madeira Beach? Women in bikinis. So I was down there, and tell you what, the sun was kicking this weekend. It was really kicking. I was out there maybe 40 minutes, and I actually got a little red just walking down and back 2 days in a row. So those people, once again, being out there, probably not with a lot of sunscreen on, skin cancer just waiting to happen. People, you just got to take care of yourselves. I know you have busy lives. I know. I get it. But for your long-term health, for your spouse's peace of mind, work together on it. Maybe you can do something together. I know one person trying to get in shape is a little hard when the other one doesn't want to. I get that. But do it for your children. You want to be around here for as long as possible to see them grow up and have kids of their own. Take care of yourselves. And there's going to be a sense of self-confidence that's going to come along with that if you can improve your health situation and the way you look. And I don't mean going under the knife. I would never tell anybody to get any plastic surgery, even though I know that's popular. I would never tell any man or woman to do that. But just the natural, doing it the natural way. Take a little pride in yourself. And it's easier to do than you think. I know for all of you who have worked your way up through companies and grinded it out 60 hours a week and have managed to do that, I can tell you, getting in shape, losing some weight is easier than that. So the beach was packed this weekend, and I'm sure it was packed out there today. I did not have a chance to go out today because of doing the show and some other things I had to do. So get in shape, people. Get in shape. And before I get into my Memorial Day show, I do have to tell you that I did get a lot of responses, most of them negative, from the alt-right concerning my talk about the alt-right movement, this nationalist, white supremacist movement. And they certainly are predictable. All the cliches, because I don't agree with them, I must be gay. Because I don't agree with them and what they think, I must be this, I must be that. Somebody even said, well, you must be Jewish. Tell you what, all of my Catholic upbringing, that would surely be a surprise to my parents for them to find out that I was Jewish. Of course I'm not. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I love Jewish people. Love Israel. But it's just interesting that I would get a response like that to what I talked about. In fact, I don't even think, did I even mention anything about Jews or Israel or Semitism or anti-Semitism? I don't even remember saying that. But somehow somebody sent that comment to me, well, you must be Jewish. Of course, it's a put down. In their mind, that's a put down. In mine, it's just, well, they're just getting it wrong. I'm not Jewish. If there's anything wrong with that, love Jews. But it's a put down when they use it. It's surely not a put down when I use it. But that will ultimately be their downfall. That they're full of cliches and stereotypes. And they're totally, totally predictable. Mm-hmm. But those responses are also the reason that I now take my Glock 19 everywhere I go. Just to be honest with you. So let's get right to the show. I hope to not ever talk about the alt-right movement again, by the way. I don't like giving them any more time, anything like that, any more time than I have to. And there's so many other things to talk about. So let's move on. Memorial Day. The thought that occurs to me every Memorial Day, and if you were to go back and find my show from a year ago, and from 2 years ago, from 3 years ago, if you can find it out there, of course, nothing ever dies on the internet. The thought that comes to mind every Memorial Day is, I think about what's gone on in the last 15 years. And I can't imagine the pain that military families have gone through. I'm not going to say that I've been fortunate. I don't want to define it that way. But in my family, my dad was in the Army. He got drafted, but then he chose to go in. When he knew that he was going to get drafted, he signed up voluntarily because he would have more choices that way. And he did his 2 years. He was in South Korea for a while back in the 50s after the Korean War. But besides that, I don't have any military members in my family. My brothers, my sister were not in the military. My biological father was, but really I didn't know him that well. As you know, I'm adopted. But my real dad, Ed Dentzel Sr., like I said, was in the military for a couple years. I had a couple friends that were in the military. One of them I went to college with, who went to the Marines after he graduated from college. So, and I haven't had anybody die in my family associated with any war. However, I had some great-great-grandfather who fought for the Union in the Civil War, and my dad still has my great-great-great, how many greats? His sword and his hat and his discharge papers from the Union Army, which are fascinating to me because they'd be like 150 years old now. So it's hard for me to put myself in the place of those families and what they've endured all these years. And I can't imagine them looking at what has happened, for example, in Iraq and having young men and women who have died there. And then we have a president who in 2011 just got out of there and allowed ISIS and terrorists to take over most of that country again. We as civilians have not, as much as a lot of civilians have done for military members and their families, I wonder if we've done enough. And I don't mean in terms of time and money and benefit concerts and charities and everything else. And that's all good. And it's all good. But I wonder if, I think about going back to, let's think about it this way. Going back to World War II, fighting the Nazis, the the Third Reich in Japan, and the entire country suffered because of that. Everybody had to make sacrifices. And I think because of that, that war ended very quickly. Remember, the United States was only involved in World War II for about 4 years. Technically not even 4 years. We think about all these battles and all the movies that were made about it, and all these famous people that we now know, General Patton, General MacArthur, the rest of them. It only lasted less than 4 years. And you look back at it now, and it could be because everybody, the civilians who were never going to go overseas to fight for our country, they had a little bit unpleasant too. Not as unpleasant as the soldiers on the front lines, but there was rationing. Everybody was pushed toward this war effort. Forget making cars. Chrysler, the rest of the companies, they're going to make tanks and trucks and airplanes. But just a few years later in the Korean War, it wasn't the same thing. There wasn't to any extent compared to World War II of the sacrifices that your average civilian in the United States needed to make. Same way with Vietnam, starting in the early 60s and going right up through the the early 70s. No civilian had to make any sacrifices for all those men. I guess there might have been a few women who went over to Vietnam. And that war just continued to drag out. And in fact, really in modern history, in the last 50, 60 years, it's been we're going to go fight over there. Still, we have to make sure that our country, our economy is going well, and everybody continues to have these booming times. And it seems maybe that we could just take for what those people are doing going over to these other countries and fighting and having bullets whiz by their heads and some of them dying and some of them getting limbs blown off. Maybe we just don't take it as seriously as we should. And maybe that's what's allowed the Vietnam War to go on for so long, for example. That if had there been a national movement to finish this war in as quickly as possible, because a lot of people who had no intentions on going to Vietnam were suffering too. Couldn't buy as much gas as you want. There weren't as many cars to buy. Not as many products on the shelves because some of those products were headed to the military. Maybe our civilian population would have been, well, let's do something. Let's get this thing done as fast as possible. Instead, we didn't. It was an escalation war. Right? Got bogged down, quagmire, not wanting to bomb certain targets. Is it safe to say that we would have bombed all of North Vietnam's targets had the civilian population in the United States been suffering a little bit? I think the civilian population said, yeah, bomb the heck out of North Vietnam. Just get this thing over with. That's what would have happened. But because everybody got to live in these cushy conditions and their air conditioning and their soft couches, that war was allowed to continue for too long. Fighting against what was definitely an inferior enemy. Granted, being financed by China, being financed by the Soviets at the time, but still an inferior army. And so we get here to modern times, the last 15 years, with what has gone on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what was, we kind of did the same thing. Yes, we're going to go over to Iraq. Yes, we're going to go over to Afghanistan. But here in the United States, we want to make sure that nobody suffers because of that. We're going to make sure that the economy is great and market forces are at work. And although everybody knew that there were military people going to foreign lands and fighting a dangerous enemy, I'm just wondered how many civilians who weren't connected to Iraq or Afghanistan too closely, really were bothered by that at all. Had it been that we had started rationing in the United States in 2001 into 2002 after September 11th, and cars weren't as easy to buy, and maybe the stock market wasn't going up, and people had to devote so much work or time, not necessarily getting into the military, but devoting time to something regarding the war effort, maybe Iraq and Afghanistan would be distant memories by this time, because every civilian, the 300 million of us who are still in the United States, would be like, this sucks. We can't do this, we can't do that. Let's get this. We know that we need to beat the enemy, so let's do this as fast as possible. But instead, because we had it so cushy over those years and other people paying for our freedom, just sit back and go about our daily business as if nothing was going on. Except for those families who had military members over in Iraq, Afghanistan, these dangerous places. And I think what history has shown us is when a civilian population never has to suffer for its military going somewhere, you can pretty much guarantee that probably that war is going to go on a lot longer than it needs to. I think that's something that you could learn from that. Or we could all learn from that. And not to mention that then, on top of that, when nobody's suffering, you put into office a president who kind of has that same attitude. Could not be bothered more. Or is it less? How would I want to put it? Barack Obama did not want to be bothered with Afghanistan and Iraq at all. Didn't want to get that to get in the way of his agenda. So he became president, and that's the way he treated those places. Just not important. Not important to the point where he brought at least all of our military members in Iraq out of there, despite, once again, our fight there not being over. And he did it for political reasons. Don't get me wrong. I know why politicians do that in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, because they know that when the civilian population suffers, that may mean that some representatives and senators don't get reelected. Get it? And they know the cushier they can keep the United States and just pretend that those wars aren't happening, the more likely they are, once again, to get reelected. Same with Barack Obama. Same kind of thing. He knew that to have any credibility going into the 2012 elections, he needed to be out of Iraq, because that's what he said he was going to do when he was running for president in 2008. No matter what the consequences might be, but let's not forget something. The reason that we were even in Iraq in 2011 is because maybe we just didn't I don't want to say not fight hard enough, because I know every man and woman over there has fought as hard as they could. Just tactically didn't do some of the right things. I still believe I'm not going to be one of these conservatives who changes his mind all these years later. I still believe that going into Iraq was still the right thing to do. It's just, when you get there, how about finishing it up in a couple years? Is that too much to ask? Instead, worrying about winning hearts and minds and this and that, only got more Americans killed. And here we are, we're still in Afghanistan. And of course, if you read the news, we're kind of back in Iraq now. Remember this story from a few weeks ago? I didn't have a chance to talk about it. This American SEAL who got killed. And of course, the administration wanted to portray it as a non-combat related death. Then watching the video of what was going on, there was a news crew or somebody on their phone, I have no idea. But somebody filmed what was going on right there, right at that time when that Navy SEAL got killed. Looked like bullets flying to me, and it looked like a bunch of guys with guns to me, but that's how desperate this administration is to make sure that everybody understands there's nobody dying in Iraq. Nobody died. We're not in Iraq. We're not doing that. What I'm saying here is that a lot of military members have died, being that this is what Memorial Day is about. We're memorializing them. A lot of military people have died because civilians wanted to keep their cushy lives. They didn't want the status quo to be changed at all. They wanted, to use September 11th as an example, they wanted their lives in 2000, the year before, to be the same as it was in 2002, the year after. They wanted the things to cost the same. They wanted to go to their grocery store and have as many products on the shelves as there ever were. They wanted to be able to go on vacations, not worry about this and not worry about that, and not have to make any sacrifices. And we had a government that went along with it. And that, I think, got military members killed, because I think, once again, when you do that, all you do is then politicians are not induced to finishing these operations as quickly as possible. However, when you're civilians, their lifestyle's a little cramped and they start emailing, calling, texting, tweeting their representatives, their senators, and maybe even the president, and they want to win, and they want solutions, then maybe those solutions will come faster. And the faster you do something, the less people are going to get killed. So before we as civilians on this Memorial Day get too self-righteous about how we are honoring military members today, we have to remember that the reason that so many have been killed is because we've wanted things a certain way. And we weren't really willing to sacrifice ourselves. Our products, the products we want, the services we want, that is a huge part of, it's a decent percentage. I mean, really, just try to have some sort of revisionist history in your mind, going back to World War II. What would have happened if we just would have gone into World War II? Now, granted, I know the Great Depression, before then, I don't know how many people wanted things to stay that way anyway. But just imagine a situation of World War II where the civilian population, their lifestyles aren't cramped at all. Do you really believe that we still finish that war in under 4 years? You really think that we take as many chances that we did in World War II? I mean, D-Day, whether you believe it or not, was a huge chancy operation. There's no guarantee it was going to work. The United States, not long before that, had tried something called Market Garden. It was trying to finish the World War II before Christmas 1944. That was a disaster. Mm-hmm. Everything in World War II was about finishing things as quickly as possible. Because that's how you get the least amount of people killed. You draw it out, more people are going to get killed. Messing around, don't want to bomb this, don't want to bomb that. And that's what happened in Vietnam. And then I would say to a little bit of a lesser extent, but still somewhat, with Iraq and Afghanistan. It took the form more of hearts and minds, and we don't want to bomb these sections because it's going to tick these people off, and we don't want to do this because it's going to tick those people off, and we have to honor these customs and those customs, and all it does is get Americans killed. That's all it does. If you're going to go in, you go in 100%, you fix the problem, and then you get out. And that hasn't been an American attitude since World War II. So you have all these military members, American military members, who are dead on this day. And a little bit, we as civilians, we have to take blame for at least a little part of that. As for those family members, I can't imagine. I just cannot imagine how they feel when they turn on the TV or they go on the internet and they go to their favorite news sites and see these places that their daughter, son died in, and then seeing ISIS still there. A place that their daughter, son fought against Iraqi forces back in 2003, 2004 to take back for the Iraqis. Then all these years later, ISIS now controls it. And their daughter, their son, is gone. I just can't imagine that. We've all experienced death in our lives. You get to be old enough, you're going to start experiencing death sooner or later. A grandparent, an uncle, maybe, unfortunately, a father or mother who dies too soon. Maybe you had a brother or sister that died in a car wreck. Those are all horrible, horrible things. But imagine being reminded of that and the wastefulness of it every time you turn on the news. You know, I know from experience, the pain of losing somebody like that in a civilian situation, a heart attack, a car wreck, whatever the case may be. The pain never truly goes away, but it ebbs, and you just learn to live with it, and you think, well, death is just a part of life. For there to be life, there has to be death. And for there to be death, there has to be life. But imagine being reminded of that all the time. And that it wasn't an accident, it was a mistake in strategy. It was a mistake in attitude. It was a mistake, it wasn't even a mistake, even in Barack Obama's case, pulling out of Iraq, it was on purpose. Imagine that grandparent that you love so much, your brother or sister you love so much, finding out that they died on purpose, not in a military situation, but they died on purpose, and then being reminded of that every day instead of it just being a simple accident. Then you can maybe start to get close to what I think that these military family members feel every day. Can't imagine. I just don't know how. I really don't know how they control themselves. I don't know. I don't know how they just don't completely lose their minds and go after the people who have caused this. I'll just be honest with you. But that's what I think about when I think about Memorial Day. But I got to go to the break. You're listening to the Dentzel Domain on Red State Talk Radio.
The voice of American conservatism. WRS Digital, Red State Talk Radio.
And we're back at the Dentzel Domain on Red State Talk Radio. Let's move on to something a little bit related. I knew that Memorial Day was coming up, and that's why I've saved this topic for now. I could have talked about it last week when it happened, but Barack Obama went over to Japan, was the first president to go to Hiroshima. I think I read that right. He was the first person to go there since it happened, since that bombing happened in 1945. And he dished out one of his, never says apology, but in reading his words, and so many words, he's once apologizing for the United States and what we did to Japan. And once again, this goes along the lines of, it's easy for you to talk, Barack Obama. It's easy for you to talk. Because if you go back to 1945, the reason that we dropped those bombs, first of all, was because we had them. We engineered them. Our scientists came up with these weapons. So we used them, first of all, because we had them. A weapon is only good if you're willing to use it. Second of all, there were calculations done regarding what it would take to, at the time, to attack the mainland of Japan and to overtake it and to conquer it. And the estimations were that it was an astronomical number. Astronomical amount of men who would have been killed trying to do that. Astronomical. I don't remember, like in 6 figures to do that. And we know how many men died just trying to take over some of those outlying islands like Iwo Jima and the rest of them. In the Philippines and elsewhere. We know how many men died doing that. And although they were successful, but those are the men who we honor today on Memorial Day. But as you can imagine, trying to attack an enemy's homeland, just like it happened in Germany, that's a big deal. That's going to be the hardest of all hard things to do. And so the American leaders, Harry Truman, made a decision. We just can't do that. We're not. It's just not worth it. We have these weapons. We're going to use them, and we'll drop one if they don't like it. And if we'll drop another one, we'll drop number 2 if they don't surrender. And I'm sure, had Japan continued to hold out, that we would have continued to drop nuclear bomb after nuclear bomb. Granted, we would have had to keep building them, and I don't know how many we had at the time, but we would have figured something out to do this. Because there was no way the military leaders and the politicians were going to get that many men killed doing that when you could do it by some other means. So I just want to remind you why we dropped those bombs. It's not because we're dirty, we're nasty, we're not playing fair, that we don't like civilian populations. It was Japanese leaders who brought it upon themselves, first of all. Secondly, it was the civilian population in Japan that chose to treat their leader as some sort of god. We were already bombing them conventionally. They had virtually no air force left. Japan did. And still, the civilian population wasn't willing to give in, couldn't put enough pressure on their leaders to surrender. So we needed to make a point. And all I can tell you is that Japan was very lucky that when we dropped those bombs, that we didn't even drop them on bigger cities. And they're very fortunate that we just didn't wait until we had 4 or 5 of those things and drop them all at one time. We dropped one, and we wanted to stop. They were the ones who didn't want to stop. So we had to drop a second one. And then they got the idea. And that sucks. But that's life. So that's why we use those nuclear weapons. But there's another part of this as well. And this is the part that I'm not so sure conservatives get, and I'm really sure your average American doesn't get. I don't necessarily don't like them, but as much as certain people don't like nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons are the only thing that have kept us from having another world war in this world since the 1940s. I know what you're saying. Well, the Korean War was bad. Sucks. Sucks we had to go there. Sucks we had to work with the South Korean people. It sucks that the situation is what it is today. But compared to a world war like World War II, it was nothing. And I honor every man that died in the war. It was unfortunate. It sucks. I wish we didn't have to do it. Same way with Vietnam. It sucks. But the reason that didn't turn into something bigger, because we know what was going on behind the scenes. The Chinese were helping the North Vietnamese. The Soviets wanted us to get into a quagmire in Vietnam, so they were helping the North Vietnamese. But the reason it didn't turn into an American versus China versus Russia war, Soviet Union war, is because of nuclear weapons. And although it's terrible that 55,000 men, American men, died in Vietnam from 1963 or 64 until 1972, 73. Imagine that being in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions, if we'd have gotten into something bigger. But the reason it didn't happen, nuclear weapons. There's a reason that we've not had an all-out war since the 1940s. And it's because of nuclear weapons. There's a reason that the United States and the Soviet Union, despite being complete enemies of each other, never fought against each other directly from the 1950s until 1990. There's a reason. The reason? Nuclear weapons. And I can assure you, if nuclear weapons didn't exist, the Soviet Union would have tried to take over. Sometime down the road after World War II, they would have tried to take over all of Europe. They would have marched in there. They would have. They would have gone down through working with North Korea and North Vietnam at the time. They would have worked their way right down into Asia, into India, anywhere they wanted to go. What kept them doing from that? The threat of nuclear warfare. And I'm sure they're looking at it from their point of view, going back then. Well, if they didn't have nuclear weapons, and we know the Russians eventually did get them, stealing the technology, by the way. But they're afraid that we would have... What could we have done? It's hard for me to put myself in the mind of a Soviet general in the 1950s or 60s, but maybe we would have done something much more aggressive than we did during those years. And we didn't want to do it because of our fear of nuclear weapon attack from the Soviets. So we had detente all those years. That kind of worked, didn't quite work, and then we know what happened when Ronald Reagan got into office. He figured out a different way of beating the Soviet Union without ever having to fire a shot. And that was through political pressure, and that was through market forces. He figured we're just going to bankrupt them. And that was something that he had been learning about and he knew about for years. The way to beat the Soviet Union was to beat them, forcing them to build up their military when they couldn't afford to do so. But at the same time, talking to them, telling them we want peace, but here's what we're going to do, but we don't want to do this, but too bad. And the only way that could happen was because nuclear weapons existed. The truth is this: if nuclear weapons didn't exist, had never been invented, say we just didn't get around, say we tried that technology, just couldn't make it work, and we would have nothing but conventional bombs and the possibility of conventional warfare, who knows what the 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s looks like. I'd say we would have had at least one more world war, if not two. And the amount of casualties would have been outrageous compared to the amount of casualties that we had in that same time period in reality. Whatever that adds up to, how many Americans died between after World War II, the end of World War II, and 1980, that would have been minuscule compared to the amount that would have died had nuclear weapons not existed. There is no doubt in my mind at all. Nuclear weapons are a deterrent to huge conventional warfare. And if we ever make something even more powerful than nuclear weapons, say something that could destroy the earth with one push of a button, that will also be a deterrent to conventional warfare. Now, what goes along with nuclear weapons is responsibility. And that's what lefties and other people worried about for so many years. And I guess you could be concerned about it today. But let's get something clear regarding all of this today, regarding nuclear weapons. Had we failed and not invented nuclear weapons in the early 1940s, probably somebody else would have. And there's no guarantee that it would have been an ally of ours. In fact, you could even extrapolate that out. Had us, nor the Soviets, nor anyone else invented it, just once again a failed technology. Here's what I know. I know terrorists would never stop trying to figure it out. And then they would have the first nuclear bomb. And then what? It would be a worse situation than we are in now, where terrorists are trying to get their hands on nuclear weapons. It would be worse, not better. They would be the only ones with the ultimate device, not us. So Barack Obama can do all this fantasizing, and all these lefties can do all the fantasizing they want about a war without nuclear weapons. Yes, well, you know what? We'll replace it. Then they can fantasize about conventional wars all the time. That would make what has gone on in Iraq and Afghanistan make it look like nothing. In reality, we know it is something. But compared to a huge aircraft carriers fighting against each other, submarines shooting torpedoes at each other, hundreds of thousands of men on front lines with tanks and bazookas. You talk about a death toll. You talk about living in fear. That's exactly what you would get if nuclear weapons didn't exist. have to remember that war is part of our nature as humans. We can be nasty, we can be very, very kind, but we can be very, very nasty. We can be very charitable, we can be very selfish. War is part of that. And part of us, though, also has that idea of self-preservation, survival. And most people, 99.99% of the people on this earth, do not want nuclear weapons to be used. That's exactly the reason we have them. I should also say that I think that nuclear weapons are one of the reasons. Another reason is from the political side. Once again, going back to my example from the first part of the show, that too many politicians that have gotten us involved in these wars and went into these wars and wanted to kind of tread lightly. And they had the advantage of doing that because you can sometimes do that with conventional warfare. There is no treading lightly with nuclear weapons. And suddenly those politicians start thinking, well, geez, even here in the United States, I'm not even safe here. Nuclear weapon might be dropped on Washington, D.C. or New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Chicago. And that brings the war a little too close to home. And that's another reason that we need nuclear weapons to hopefully keep some of our politicians in line. I don't know how well it's been done, but I'm sure that goes through their minds. So, nuclear weapons exist for a good reason. I know the destruction that they cause is horrible. There is not a documentary out there that I have not seen about the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I've seen them all. I've seen them all. I take an interest in that stuff, whether I do this show or not. And it's all horrible. But never once when I watch any of those documentaries do I think that it shouldn't have been done. Because I know what the alternative was. It's easy to look at something in a vacuum when you don't realize that, well, you had alternatives. I guess we could have just stayed away from Japan. Could have just allowed them to do what they were going to do. Maybe even allow them to build up their military again. How about that in 1945 into maybe 46? Would that have sat well with all of you peaceniks? What about that? Or should we have gotten all those American military members killed who then would have to attack the Japanese mainland? And how many people would not be here today if that happened? Any of you who had grandfathers, would it be great-grandfathers at this time, who were involved in World War II, maybe they were the ones who would have been asked to attack Japan and they would have gotten killed. And guess what? No grandfather, no grandchildren. Too many people don't think in those terms either. I just don't know what the alternative was going to be at that time. Once again, if you don't look at it in a vacuum. But Barack Obama, we shouldn't be surprised. There are many other people like him who think the same way. Whereas, as I've always pointed out, going with the ISIS example or any other enemy of the United States, if ISIS were a bunch of conservatives, Barack Obama would have dropped a nuclear bomb on them 2 years ago. I'm sure that Barack Obama would love a nuclear weapon if he could just make all conservatives disappear with one push of a button. Right? I know that's kind of weird to think of it that way, but isn't that true? I think it is. Wouldn't he fight ISIS harder if it were a bunch of conservatives who believed in freedom of religion and were pro-life and were pro-Second Amendment, wouldn't he have dropped the bomb on us by this time? Of course he would have. He would have dropped 2, 3 nuclear. He would have shot every nuclear weapon in arsenal at us if we were in the Middle East. So all of you can think about that. One more thing before I go. And I was listening to, and this gets off probably the topic of Memorial Day. So I was listening to the podcast done by Mona Sharon and Jay Nordlinger at Need to Know, I think it's called. And this topic about how Republicans, and they don't think this way, but a lot of people who are supporting Donald Trump think this way, that Republicans didn't fight Barack Obama enough over the last 8 years, or maybe 6 years when we started having control. It's not me anymore. I'm not in the Republican Party, but the Republicans gained control of the House in 2010. That Republicans didn't do enough. If you ever hear that by anybody, you get into an argument with somebody, you need to ask them this question. So you're saying that things would be better if Republicans hadn't gotten control of the House than control of the Senate? Were you perfect? Are you going to say that you would have been comfortable with the Democrats being in control of the House and the Senate for the last 8 years? What do you think that would have looked like? Granted, the last 7.5 years of Barack Obama's presidency has not been a treat for conservatives. But the only way it is even the way it is because of Republicans being in the Congress. See what I'm saying there? Didn't do enough. The only reason that we're even in some even measure of anything is because of the stopping of some of Barack Obama's agenda. We know what would have happened had the Democrats been in charge of Congress all of these years. We know what would have happened. And that so many Trump supporters are so fast to poo-poo what the Republicans have done, all you have to do is do a little revisionist history and ask them, oh, so I guess you just wanted the Democrats just to be in charge that whole time. Are you saying that would have been better? And when they say no, also the Republicans have done something. I know you think that it's not enough, but we always want more. That's a animal tendency, just a part of life. Everybody wants more. Dogs want more, cats want more, bears want more, lions want more, humans want more. But you act like they did nothing, whereas now you're admitting they did do something. And in fact, you know there's a stark difference between a Republican Congress and a Democrat Congress. No matter what you say about, oh, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them, now that I'm asking you these questions, you're admitting that there is. And I just think it's amazing how you can so easily lie to yourself for just one politician who thinks he can come in here and save everything. That's amazing to me. But I got to go. EdwardDentzel.com is where you can find all of my old Red State Talk Radio shows. You can also find my shows at Podbean, SoundCloud, Podomatic, and YouTube. You can find me at Facebook, LinkedIn. Email me, EdwardDentzel@Reagan.com. Twitter, Dentzel Domain. EdwardDentzel.com/book. It's where you can download for free the first chapter of my next novel called The Comebacks. You can also find my other show, non-political show, America's Missing Podcast. You can find that at Podomatic and YouTube. It's been a pleasure talking to you on this Memorial Day. You've been listening to the Dentzel Domain on Red State Talk Radio.